On his wedding day, he mocked the homeless woman at the gate, but she was the groom's mother. The perfect day, the perfect bride, the perfect life. Until a woman in rags stood outside the church doors clutching a torn satchel and was laughed at, shamed, and cast aside by her own son. But when the truth burst out inside the ceremony, the room froze. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a beggar. She was the mother he thought he lost forever. Now, with his marriage crumbling, his wealth on the line, and his heart breaking, he must face the one question that will change everything. When the world forces you to choose between status and love, which would you sacrifice? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Daniel stepped out of the sleek black limousine, straightening his tailored tuxedo with a satisfied tug. 5,000 white roses adorned the entrance of the grand stone church, their perfume hanging in the spring air like expensive cologne, just as he'd specified, just as he'd paid for. Everything looks perfect, he murmured, more to himself than to the driver who held the door. The church's Gothic architecture towered against the cloudless blue sky, its stained glass windows catching the afternoon sunlight. Stone steps led up to massive wooden doors, now festooned with elaborate flower arrangements and ivory ribbons. The red carpet he'd ordered had been rolled out precisely as directed, not a wrinkle in sight. Daniel inhaled deeply, savoring the moment. This was the culmination of months of planning, of extensive preparations, that had cost more than most people in this small Midwestern town earned in a year. But that was the point, wasn't it? To create something extraordinary, something people would talk about for years to come. Mr. Harrington, your groomsmen are waiting inside. The wedding coordinator approached, clipboard in hand, Bluetooth earpiece firmly in place. We're right on schedule. Excellent. Daniel checked his platinum watch, a gift from his future father-in-law. I wouldn't expect anything less. He surveyed the arriving guests with approval. Men in crisp tuxedos, women in designer dresses that rustled as they made their way up the church steps. Everyone who mattered in his world was here: business associates, social connections, the people who could further his ambitions. Champagne before the ceremony was a stroke of genius. One of his groomsmen called out, approaching with a flute in hand. People are impressed. Daniel grinned. That's imported from France. Nothing but the best today. The church bells began to chime, announcing the approaching ceremony time. Daniel felt a surge of pride as he watched more luxury cars pull up to the curb. He'd come so far from his humble beginnings, farther than anyone would have predicted. This wedding was more than just a marriage. It was the final step in his transformation into the man he'd always wanted to be. Look at this place, he said, gesturing broadly at the spectacle he'd created. Not bad for a kid who grew up on the wrong side of town, huh? His best man clapped him on the shoulder. You've outdone yourself, Daniel. Catherine's family must be thrilled. They should be. I've more than lived up to their expectations. He smoothed back his perfectly styled hair. Their daughter is marrying the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. A small commotion near the church gate caught his attention. The wedding coordinator hurried over, her professional smile momentarily faltering as she spoke in hushed tones to someone Daniel couldn't quite see. What's going on over there? He asked, frowning slightly. Nothing was going to disrupt his perfect day. Probably just some wedding crasher, his best man said with a laugh. Can't blame them. This is the event of the season. Daniel started toward the gate, his irritation growing with each step. He'd planned for every contingency, anticipated every detail. Whatever this disturbance was, he would handle it quickly and discreetly. Excuse me, he said as he approached the small cluster of people. Is there a problem here? The coordinator turned, her expression tight with concern. Mr. Harrington, there's someone here who... The crowd parted slightly, and Daniel found himself looking at a thin, weathered woman in tattered clothes, her gray hair tangled beneath a faded knit cap. The bride's parents, the esteemed Dr. and Mrs. Weatherby, stood at the church entrance like royalty, greeting their subjects. Mrs. Weatherby's diamonds caught the sunlight as she air-kissed the cheeks of arriving guests, while her husband's firm handshake communicated the power he wielded as the region's most prominent surgeon. The Richardsons just arrived, whispered Daniel's best man, nodding toward a silver Bentley pulling up to the curb. Their pharmaceutical company stock doubled last quarter. Daniel's smile widened. Catherine mentioned her father might offer me a position on their board after the honeymoon. He adjusted his boutonniere and made his way to his cluster of groomsmen near the church steps. These men represented connections he'd cultivated over years of strategic networking. A bank executive, 2 attorneys, and the son of a state senator. All handpicked for their usefulness as much as their friendship. There he is, called James, raising a champagne flute. The man who's marrying into the Weatherby fortune. Daniel chuckled and accepted the drink. Not just their fortune, their name opens doors money can't buy. To Daniel Harrington, toasted Michael the banker. From the community college kid who used to detail my father's car to the newest member of the country club board. The men laughed and clinked glasses. Daniel savored both the expensive champagne and the moment. He'd spent years erasing every trace of his humble origins, crafting himself into someone worthy of this circle. Catherine's father already put me forward for membership at Lakeside Hills, Daniel boasted, naming the most exclusive golf club in 3 states. Said it was only proper that his son-in-law have access to where the real business happens. Smart man, nodded the senator's son appreciatively. That's where my father closed the Henderson development deal last month. Daniel leaned in. Between us, I've already lined up 2 major investors for that commercial project near the highway. Once I'm officially a Weatherby, we'll announce the partnership. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the champagne, with Daniel at its center. He noticed people watching him, admiring him, and felt a surge of satisfaction. He'd become someone who mattered. My future father-in-law is already talking about setting me up with my own medical supply division, he continued, straightening his Italian silk tie. Says I've got the right instincts for expansion. The church bells chimed again, signaling 15 minutes until the ceremony. Daniel glanced toward the entrance where Catherine would soon appear. Their marriage would cement his place in society, the final validation of his reinvention. That's when he noticed her. Near the wrought iron gate that separated the church grounds from the street stood a woman who didn't belong. Her clothes were mismatched and worn thin, a faded floral skirt beneath a man's oversized coat. Gray hair escaped from beneath a knit cap that had once been blue. She clutched a battered leather satchel against her chest, its surface cracked and peeling. But it was her eyes that stopped Daniel's practiced smile from reaching his lips. They were fixed on him with an unsettling intensity, pale blue eyes in a weathered face. Something about those eyes, a flicker of irritation sparked in Daniel's chest. Today of all days, couldn't the local homeless stay away? The last thing he needed was some beggar approaching his guests for handouts, embarrassing him in front of the Weatherbys and their friends. He turned sharply away, focusing instead on his groomsmen's laughter. But he could still feel those eyes on his back. Daniel's muscles tensed as the homeless woman took a hesitant step through the gate. Her worn shoes scuffed against the pristine cobblestone path that led to the church's grand entrance. A few guests glanced her way, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort. The woman moved with careful, almost reverent steps. Her gaze never left Daniel, and something in those pale blue eyes made his collar feel suddenly tight. Looks like you've attracted an admirer, James snickered, nudging Daniel's arm. The woman stopped 10 feet away, her fingers working nervously at the frayed edges of her satchel. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Daniel felt heat rise in his face. The Petersons, major clients of the Weatherby medical practice, were watching the scene unfold. Catherine's mother had paused mid-conversation, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she turned to stare. "Excuse me," Daniel called out, his voice carrying across the churchyard. "This is a private event." The woman took another step forward. "Did you hear me?" Daniel's voice hardened. He walked toward her, gesturing dismissively. "The soup kitchen is 3 blocks down. This is a wedding." His groomsmen laughed, and Daniel felt a surge of confidence. He played to his audience, knowing that handling this intrusion with the right mix of authority and humor would only enhance his image. "I think she likes your tux, Dan," called Michael. "Maybe she wants to dance at the reception." More laughter rippled through the gathering guests. "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave." Daniel stood tall, adjusting his cuffs. "We didn't hire any entertainment, and we certainly didn't budget for." He looked her up and down. Street performers. The woman's weathered face flinched at his words, but she held her ground. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hearing his name from her lips sent an uncomfortable jolt through him. How did she know who he was? Had she been following him? "Look," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I don't know how you know my name, but this is my wedding day. You don't belong here among these people. You're a beggar who wandered into the wrong world." A few guests chuckled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by the church architecture or their phone screens. "Security," Daniel called, snapping his fingers toward the uniformed men the Weatherbys had hired. "Please escort this woman back to wherever she came from." 2 security guards approached, but before they reached her, the woman's shoulders slumped in defeat. She clutched her satchel tighter, as if it contained everything precious in her life. "I'm sorry," she murmured, though not to the guards or to Daniel. It seemed she was apologizing to herself for some private failure. As she turned to leave, tears welled in her eyes. But there was something else there too, a flash of recognition, of absolute certainty. Her lips moved in a whisper so faint that no one but she could hear the words. My son. Daniel had already turned his back, accepting congratulatory pats from his groomsmen for handling the uncomfortable situation. The church bells rang again, announcing it was nearly time for the ceremony to begin. The woman disappeared beyond the gate, just another shadow on the edges of Daniel's perfect day. Inside the sanctuary, golden light streamed through stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across the marble floor. 5,000 white roses lined the aisle and adorned every pew, their perfume hanging thick in the air. Daniel stood at the altar, chin high, shoulders squared. The church quieted as the organist began the processional. Rich, resonant notes filled the vaulted ceiling. The wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open, and Catherine appeared on her father's arm. Her dress, a custom Vera Wang with a 12-foot train, shimmered with tiny crystals sewn into the silk. Her veil floated around her like morning mist. A collective gasp rippled through the 400 guests. Perfect, Daniel thought. Absolutely perfect. He watched Catherine glide toward him, her practiced smile never wavering. Judge Weatherby, her father, matched her measured steps with military precision. The man who would soon be Daniel's father-in-law, and whose connections had already opened doors to Boston's elite social circles, nodded almost imperceptibly toward Daniel. She's beautiful, Pastor Everett whispered beside him. Daniel nodded, though his thoughts had already shifted to the business meeting he'd secured with the Petersons for next week. This marriage wasn't just a union of hearts, but of fortunes, of futures carefully constructed. Catherine reached the altar. Judge Weatherby placed her hand in Daniel's with ceremonial gravity before taking his seat in the front row beside his wife, whose eyes were dry, but whose smile was camera-ready. You look stunning, Daniel whispered to Catherine. I know, she replied, squeezing his fingers a touch too tightly. Pastor Everett stepped forward, his worn Bible open in his hands. Dearly beloved, he began, his voice warm and resonant. We are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Daniel let the familiar words wash over him. He'd rehearsed this moment countless times, knew exactly when to smile, when to look solemn, when to gaze lovingly at Catherine. This performance, and that's how he'd come to think of it, would be flawless. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, the pastor continued, but reverently and soberly. A disturbance at the back of the church interrupted the pastor's words. The heavy wooden door creaked open again. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. Elder Wilson, stooped with age but still commanding respect, led someone down the aisle with gentle insistence. The homeless woman from outside followed him, her eyes downcast, clutching that worn satchel to her chest. What is she doing here? Catherine hissed through her smile. Daniel's mouth went dry. The perfect moment fractured before his eyes. I'm sorry to interrupt, Elder Wilson said, his voice carrying in the suddenly silent church. But this woman has something important to say. The murmurs grew louder. Catherine's mother half rose from her seat, her face twisted with outrage. This is outrageous, Judge Weatherby announced, standing fully. Remove this person at once. Elder Wilson shook his head. I've known Margaret Harrington for 30 years. She has every right to be here. The name hit Daniel like a physical blow. Margaret Harrington, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 20 years. The woman Margaret lifted her gaze to meet Daniel's. Those pale blue eyes, his eyes brimmed with tears and recognition. Hello, Daniel, she said, her voice stronger now than it had been in the churchyard. It's been a long time. Pastor Everett's Bible closed with a soft thump. The church remained silent except for the whispered rustling of clothing as guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Pastor, Elder Wilson said, his hand still gently resting on the woman's bony shoulder. This is Margaret Harrington. The pastor's eyes widened in recognition. He'd heard the name in whispered stories around town, but had never met the woman himself. Margaret stood taller now, summoning dignity despite her threadbare clothes. I'm Daniel's mother. A collective gasp rippled through the sanctuary. Hundreds of eyes darted between the elegant groom and the disheveled woman. The contrast between them could not have been more stark. Daniel in his tailored tuxedo, Margaret in her patched coat and scuffed shoes. That's impossible, Catherine's mother declared, her voice cutting through the hushed murmurs. Daniel's mother died years ago. Margaret shook her head, her gray-streaked hair falling across her weathered face. No, I left. There's a difference. Daniel gripped the edge of the altar, his knuckles white. The carefully constructed narrative of his life, the one he'd shared with Catherine and her family, crumbled around him. He'd told them his mother died when he was young. A cleaner story. A simpler story. A lie. Daniel was just 8 years old, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength despite its tremor. I was not well. Addiction took everything from me, my home, my dignity, and worst of all, my son. She paused, swallowing hard. I couldn't be the mother he deserved then. Whispers hissed through the pews like wind through dry leaves. Daniel felt the stares boring into him from every direction. Is this true? Catherine whispered, her question like ice against his ear. Judge Weatherby strode forward. Young lady, this is hardly the time or place. I don't mean to disrupt your beautiful day, Margaret interrupted, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. I've been sober for 12 years now. I volunteer at the mission house downtown. I've built a life centered on faith and service. Elder Wilson nodded. Margaret has been a blessing to our community for years now. She never mentioned her son was Daniel Harrington until she saw the wedding announcement in the paper. Margaret reached into her worn satchel and pulled out a small, faded photograph. I've carried this everywhere, she said, holding it up. My little boy on his 8th birthday. From the front row, someone gasped. It was unmistakably Daniel, the same dark hair, the same cleft chin, those distinctive blue eyes blowing out candles on a homemade cake. I didn't come to cause trouble, Margaret said, her voice breaking. I only wanted to see my son on his wedding day, to tell him I'm proud of the man he's become. The church fell silent. 5,000 white roses seemed to hold their breath. Daniel stood frozen, years of carefully buried memories flooding back. The smell of his mother's perfume, her laughter, the nights she read him stories. And then, the painful ones, her absence, the empty apartment, the neighbors who took him in until his uncle claimed him. Catherine stared at Daniel, her perfectly made-up face twisted in horror. Her eyes demanded an explanation, an immediate dismissal of this unwanted intrusion. But Daniel couldn't speak, couldn't move. The world had tilted on its axis, and he was falling into a past he'd spent decades trying to forget. I lost everything to addiction, Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes upon her. My marriage ended. Our home was foreclosed. And worst of all, her eyes fixed on Daniel, glistening with unshed tears. I lost my beautiful boy. The church remained silent. Even the rustling of programs had stopped. When I hit rock bottom, I was sleeping under the Jefferson Street Bridge. A volunteer from the mission house found me there. Margaret's hands trembled slightly, but her voice grew stronger. They offered me a hot meal and a warm bed, but more importantly, they offered hope. Judge Weatherby shifted uncomfortably in the front row, glancing at his daughter whose perfect wedding had veered drastically off script. Catherine stood rigid beside Daniel, her bouquet clutched so tightly that rose petals had begun to fall. Recovery wasn't easy, Margaret said. There were setbacks, dark days when I wanted to give up, but faith carried me through. For the past 7 years, I volunteered at that same mission, helping others find their way back. Mrs. Sanders, Daniel's 3rd-grade teacher, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Others in the congregation leaned forward, captivated by Margaret's story. I never stopped loving you, Daniel, not for a single day. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. I've followed your success from afar. The newspaper articles about your business achievements, the charity events you attend. She reached into her worn satchel again and pulled out a small velvet pouch. I didn't come to disrupt your happiness or claim a place in your life I haven't earned. She opened the pouch and removed a simple silver cross on a chain. This belonged to your grandmother. I only came to give you my blessing and this family heirloom for your new journey. Margaret stepped forward, the cross dangling from her fingers. I'm proud of the man you've become, Daniel. That's all I wanted to say. The church fell silent. Catherine's father cleared his throat, ready to intervene. The wedding planner hovered anxiously near the side door. Daniel stood frozen, memories washing over him like waves, his mother's warm hands braiding his hair for school, her voice singing him to sleep, the day she didn't come home. Years of building walls around those memories, constructing a version of himself that belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. Catherine tugged at his sleeve, her face tight with disapproval. Something broke loose inside Daniel's chest, a dam crumbling after years of pressure. Mom? He whispered, the word unfamiliar on his tongue after so many years. Margaret nodded, tears finally spilling down her weathered cheeks. Daniel stepped forward, away from his bride, away from the life he'd carefully constructed. One step, then another. The distance between them 15 years, 20 feet seemed impossible to cross. Yet somehow he stood before her. This stranger, this mother. I'm sorry, she whispered. Daniel hesitated, years of anger and abandonment warring with a sudden, overwhelming sense of recognition. This was his mother. Despite everything, despite all the years he knew her. He reached out and took the silver cross. Then, after another moment's hesitation, opened his arms. Margaret stepped into his embrace, her thin frame trembling against his chest. A smattering of applause broke out, led by Elder Wilson. Then more hands joined in, the sound swelling through the church like a rising tide of approval and relief. The applause died down as Judge Weatherby stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. He leaned in, his smile frozen for the benefit of the guests, while his voice came as a harsh whisper. "Get that woman out of here, now!" Daniel pulled back from Margaret, confusion crossing his face. "What?" Catherine's mother joined them, her diamond earrings catching the light as she positioned herself between Margaret and the watching congregation. "This is completely inappropriate," Mrs. Weatherby hissed. "Your situation is causing a scene at my daughter's wedding." Daniel glanced at Catherine, who stood with arms crossed, her perfect makeup unable to hide the fury in her eyes. She gave a single, firm nod of agreement with her parents. Judge Weatherby tightened his grip on Daniel's shoulder. "Have you forgotten who financed your startup? Who introduced you to the investors that made your company possible?" The threat hung in the air between them. "The Crestview deal closes next week," he continued. "That's $30 million in financing that can disappear with one phone call." Daniel felt his throat tighten. Years of work, his entire future, balanced on the edge of a knife. Margaret stepped back, her weathered hands folding the silver chain back into its pouch. She'd seen that look before, the calculations happening behind her son's eyes, weighing her worth against everything else. "It's all right," she said softly. "I understand." "You don't belong here," Catherine said, finally breaking her silence. She moved beside Daniel, slipping her arm through his, reclaiming him. "This is our day, our future." Margaret nodded, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. She searched for something there, some flicker of the boy she'd once known, but his expression had hardened, become unreadable. "The mission serves dinner at 6, Judge Weatherby said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'm sure they're missing their volunteer." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the pews. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. The business deal, the wedding, his future in-laws' connections, everything he'd worked for hung in the balance. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. Margaret's face softened with understanding and something deeper disappointment, not in him, but in herself. What right did she have to walk into his life now? What did she expect? "No, I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have come." She turned to go, dignity in every line of her thin frame. Elder Wilson stepped forward. "Margaret, please." "It's all right, Frank," she said, touching the old man's arm. "Thank you for trying." The church watched in uncomfortable silence as Margaret walked down the aisle toward the exit. Her steps were steady despite the tears that had begun to trail down her cheeks. At the massive wooden doors, she paused and looked back once. In that moment, framed by light streaming through the doorway, she seemed to Daniel both familiar and strange, a ghost from his past, a path not taken. Then she was gone, slipping out into the bright afternoon, leaving behind only the faint scent of charity shop soap and the weight of words unspoken. Daniel felt something important leaving with her, something he couldn't name. But Catherine was already squeezing his arm. Her father was nodding with approval, and the pastor was clearing his throat, ready to resume the ceremony. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began again, his voice echoing in the church that suddenly felt too large, too quiet. Daniel stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the empty doorway where Margaret had disappeared. The pastor cleared his throat pointedly. "Shall we continue?" Catherine squeezed Daniel's hand not in reassurance, but as a command. Her nails dug into his palm, pulling him back to the moment. The ceremony resumed its rhythm. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting blues and reds across the white roses that lined the aisle. Everything looked the same as before, but something fundamental had shifted. "Daniel," the pastor prompted, "your vows." Daniel fumbled in his pocket for the folded paper. His hands trembled as he unfolded it, the carefully crafted words blurring before his eyes. "I, Daniel, take you, Catherine." His voice caught. He glanced up at the expectant faces of the Weatherbys, at Catherine's perfect smile that didn't reach her eyes. "To be my wife," he continued mechanically, "to have and to hold." The words fell from his lips without feeling. Somewhere beyond these walls, his mother walked alone. The same mother who had once sung him to sleep, whose face he'd almost forgotten. Catherine recited her vows flawlessly, each word precise and practiced. But her eyes remained cold, scanning the congregation as if ensuring everyone witnessed her perfect performance. "You may kiss the bride." Daniel leaned in. Catherine's lips were stiff against his, her smile immediately returning when they separated. Applause filled the church, polite, obligatory. The organ played as they walked back down the aisle, husband and wife passing the spot where Margaret had stood moments before. The reception hall gleamed with crystal and silver. White orchids towered from centerpieces on each table. A 5-piece band played softly while guests mingled, champagne flutes clinking. "Smile," Catherine whispered through her teeth as they greeted another couple. "Everyone's watching." Daniel nodded mechanically, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. His new father-in-law clapped him on the shoulder. "Good decision today," Judge Weatherby muttered. "You've secured your future. Forget about that. Distraction." But Daniel couldn't forget. With each handshake, each toast, the hollow feeling in his chest expanded. The champagne tasted flat. The music seemed distant. "I need some air," he whispered to no one in particular. He slipped away, past the gift table piled with expensive packages, through French doors that led to a stone balcony overlooking manicured gardens. The night air hit his face, cool and clarifying. Stars scattered across the sky above him. Somewhere under those same stars walked Margaret. What was she doing now? Had she returned to the mission? Was she alone? Daniel loosened his bow tie, feeling like it was choking him. 20 stories below, traffic moved through the city streets. People going home to families. People with nowhere to go. He pulled the wedding band from his pocket, the one he'd slipped off during dinner, because it felt too tight, too constraining. The platinum circle caught the moonlight, gleaming cold and perfect. Behind him, music and laughter continued. His new life waited, the life he'd worked for, schemed for, climbed toward. But all he could see was Margaret's face as she turned to leave. The quiet dignity in her walk as she disappeared into the sunlight. Carrying with her a part of himself he hadn't known, was missing until now. Sunlight streamed through the honeymoon suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, falling across Daniel's face. He opened his eyes, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar room. The events of yesterday crashed back: the wedding, his mother, the choice he'd made. Catherine stood at the mirror, already dressed in a cream-colored sundress, applying lipstick with precision. Her reflection caught his movement. Finally awake, she didn't turn. "Room service brought breakfast an hour ago. It's cold now." Daniel sat up, his head pounding. The champagne from last night had done nothing to quiet his thoughts. "I was thinking we could tour the vineyard this afternoon," Catherine continued, smoothing her hair. "The concierge says they offer private tastings for honeymooners." "Sounds fine," Daniel mumbled. Catherine finally turned, her expression hardening. "You know, you could at least pretend to be happy. Everyone noticed how pitiful you looked during the ceremony." "Pitiful?" The word stung more than it should have. Yes, pitiful. Standing there like some lost child. She snapped her compact mirror shut. "My father's golf partners were watching. The mayor was watching. Do you understand what that woman almost cost us? That woman is my mother." Catherine rolled her eyes. "A mother who abandoned you, then showed up in rags to ruin your wedding. Our wedding." She picked up her purse. "I'm going to the spa. Pull yourself together before dinner. The Prestons are meeting us at 7. The door clicked shut behind her. Daniel slumped back against the pillows, relief washing over him at being alone. He glanced at the untouched breakfast tray, fresh fruit, pastries, coffee in a silver pot, all perfectly arranged, perfectly meaningless. He showered and dressed mechanically, his mind elsewhere. The hotel suite felt suffocating despite its luxury. Without conscious decision, he found himself in the lobby, then outside on the sunlit street. "Going somewhere, Mr. Harrington?" The doorman smiled, reaching to hail a taxi. "No, thank you. Just walking." Daniel wandered through downtown, past boutiques and cafes where well-dressed people laughed over brunch. His feet carried him away from the hotel district toward less polished streets. Shop windows gave way to pawn shops and discount stores. On a corner, he spotted a man sweeping the sidewalk outside a diner. "Excuse me," Daniel approached hesitantly. "I'm looking for information about a local mission." "For the homeless?" The man leaned on his broom. "You mean Grace Street Mission? 3 blocks that way, just past the old library. Do you know anything about the volunteers there?" "Sure do. Good folks. They serve breakfast and dinner daily. Some even live above the place." The man studied Daniel's expensive clothes. "You looking to donate?" "No. I mean, maybe. I'm looking for someone. A woman named Margaret." Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. "Margaret? Gray hair? Kind eyes? She's there most days. Makes the best apple cobbler on Thursdays." Daniel's heart quickened. "That's her. She's my mother." The man's expression softened. "Well, now, that's something. Margaret's helped a lot of folks around here. She'll be there now. They're serving Sunday lunch till 2. "Thank you," Daniel said. already turning in the direction the man had pointed. He walked faster now, crossing intersections without waiting for lights, passing strangers without seeing them. The elegant hotel and Catherine's cold eyes receded with each step. Ahead, a simple sign reading Gray Street Mission came into view, and Daniel felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. The mission occupied an old brick building with peeling paint and a wooden cross hanging above the door. Daniel hesitated on the sidewalk, smoothing down his designer shirt and wondering if he should have changed into something less conspicuous. He took a deep breath and pulled open the door. The smell hit him first, a mix of disinfectant, old building, and something savory cooking. The main room was simple but clean, with mismatched tables and chairs filled with people bent over steaming bowls. Volunteers moved between tables, refilling cups and offering bread from plastic baskets. And there she was. Margaret stood behind a serving counter, ladling thick soup into bowls. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a faded blue apron over clothes that had seen better days. Yet there was something in her bearing that commanded respect, a quiet dignity that transcended her circumstances. She smiled at each person she served, sometimes touching a shoulder or exchanging a few words that made them laugh. No trace of the tears or humiliation from yesterday showed on her face. Daniel slipped into a corner, watching. A heavyset volunteer approached him. "You here for lunch, honey?" Still plenty left. "No, I'm just," Daniel faltered. The woman followed his gaze to Margaret. "You know our Margaret?" Before he could answer, Margaret looked up. Their eyes met across the room. Her hand froze mid-air, soup ladle suspended over a bowl. For a moment, neither moved. Then Margaret handed the ladle to another volunteer, wiped her hands on her apron, and made her way through the tables toward him. Daniel's throat tightened. What would he say? What could possibly explain his behavior yesterday? His failure to defend her? She stopped a few feet away, eyes searching his face. Up close, he noticed the fine wrinkles around her eyes, the weathered hands that had once tucked him into bed. "Daniel," she said softly, "I didn't expect to see you here. I asked around town. Someone told me where to find you." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions. "I'm sorry about yesterday," they both said simultaneously, then stopped, surprised. "You have nothing to apologize for," Daniel said quickly. "I'm the one who should be sorry. The things I said at the gate before I knew." Margaret shook her head. "I shouldn't have come. It was selfish of me." "No," Daniel said firmly. "No, it wasn't selfish. You're my mother. You had every right to be there." A complicated emotion crossed Margaret's face, something between hope and wariness. "I just wanted to see you, to know you turned out all right." She glanced at his expensive watch, his polished shoes. "And you did. You've done well for yourself." Daniel felt a stab of shame at her assessment. What would she think if she knew the true cost of his success? The corners cut, the people stepped on. "Have you eaten?" Margaret asked suddenly. "No, but I don't want to take food meant for—" "Nonsense. We have plenty." Her smile returned, tentative but warm. "Will you join me? I'm due for a break anyway." She gestured toward an empty table in the corner. A simple invitation, yet it felt momentous. "I'd like that," Daniel said, surprised at how much he meant it. "Good," Margaret nodded. "You sit. I'll bring us both some soup." Daniel sat opposite Margaret, watching steam rise from the thick vegetable soup she'd placed before him. He took a tentative spoonful, surprised by its rich flavor. "This is good," he said. "Really good." Margaret smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's nothing fancy, but it fills you up." The simple phrase triggered a memory so vivid it nearly took his breath away. He was 5 years old, asking for seconds of her potato stew. She'd used those exact words while ladling more into his bowl. "You used to make potato stew on Sundays," Daniel said quietly. "With those little carrots I hated." Margaret's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "You remember that?" "I remember more than I realized." Daniel stirred his soup, watching the vegetables swirl. "The songs you sang when I couldn't sleep. Something about moonlight and angels. 'Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee all through the night.'" Margaret sang softly, her voice thin but steady. "Guardian angels God will send thee all through the night." The lullaby hung in the air between them, bridging 20 years of absence. "You had the worst nightmares," Margaret continued. "You'd wake up crying about monsters. Nothing would calm you except that song and warm milk with honey." Daniel nodded, surprised by the lump forming in his throat. "And you'd sit with me until I fell back asleep." They ate in silence for a moment, the simple soup taking on the weight of lost years. "What happened?" Daniel finally asked. "After you left?" Margaret set down her spoon, fingers tracing the edge of her bowl. I was sick, Daniel. Not the kind doctors can fix easily. She met his eyes. Addiction took everything from me, my pride, my home, my son. I hit bottom so many times I lost count. But you got better. Someone found me behind a liquor store, half frozen one winter. Brought me here. She gestured to the mission around them. They didn't judge, just helped. And somewhere along the way, I found something to live for beyond the next drink. Daniel looked down at his half-eaten soup. I used to hate you, he admitted, for leaving. I deserved that hate. No, Daniel said firmly. You were sick. I understand that now. Margaret reached across the table, her weathered hand hovering uncertainly before touching his. I failed you, Daniel. No explanation changes that. I'm sorry, more sorry than words can say. Her touch was gentle, like a butterfly landing on his skin. Without thinking, Daniel turned his hand over, clasping hers. I'm sorry too, he said, for yesterday, for not standing up for you. You were shocked. And your new family, they're not my family, Daniel interrupted. Not like... He stopped, unsure how to finish. The mission had emptied out, volunteers cleaning up around them. Margaret glanced at her watch. My shift's over, she said. I should head home. Daniel stood quickly. Let me walk you. Outside, twilight painted the street purple-gray. They walked in comfortable silence, Margaret leading them down a narrow side street to the mission's back entrance. I live upstairs, she explained, gesturing to a set of metal stairs. The mission lets me stay in exchange for extra hours. Daniel looked up at the modest building, wondering what her life was like within those walls. Would you like to come up? Margaret asked hesitantly. Just for a few minutes? It's not much, but I'd like that, Daniel said, and followed his mother up the stairs. Margaret pushed open the door to reveal a modest one-room apartment. A twin bed with a patchwork quilt sat in one corner, a small kitchenette in another. The space was clean but sparsed a second-hand armchair with worn armrests, a small wooden table with two mismatched chairs, and a bookshelf filled with paperbacks. It's not much, Margaret said, switching on a floor lamp that cast a warm glow across the room. Daniel stepped inside, noticing how every item seemed to have a purpose. No excess, no waste, nothing for show. The contrast to his own luxury apartment struck him, his designer furniture chosen to impress, not comfort. I like it, he said truthfully. It feels. He searched for the word. Peaceful. Margaret smiled, relieved. Tea? Please. While Margaret filled a kettle, Daniel noticed a small shelf above her bed. On it sat 3 framed photographs and a Bible so worn its leather cover had softened to the texture of cloth. He moved closer, drawn to the photos. The first showed a much younger Margaret holding a toddler himself, he realized with a start. His chubby face beamed at the camera. The second was Daniel's elementary school portrait, the cheap backdrop and his missing front tooth bringing back forgotten memories. The third photo made him pause. A young man with Daniel's jawline smiled confidently, arm wrapped around a beautiful young Margaret. Your father, Margaret said, coming to stand beside him. Thomas Harrington. You look more like him every year. Daniel picked up the frame. I barely remember him. He was a good man, kind, stubborn sometimes. She smiled softly. He loved you fiercely. What happened to him? Daniel had grown up with vague explanations from relatives. An accident, they'd said, when he was 4. Construction accident. The company wasn't following safety protocols. Margaret gently took the photo, tracing the outline of Thomas's face. After we lost him, everything fell apart. The grief. I couldn't handle it properly. The kettle whistled. Margaret returned to the kitchenette while Daniel examined the Bible on her shelf. Opening it, he found pages marked with highlights and notes in careful handwriting. This helped me find my way back, Margaret explained, returning with 2 steaming mugs. When I was at my lowest, these words gave me hope. She handed him a chipped mug. Even when I couldn't find you, I prayed you were safe. Daniel sipped his tea, surprised by an unexpected sense of comfort washing over him. You kept my picture all this time. Of course I did. Margaret sat in the armchair, gesturing for Daniel to take one of the kitchen chairs. You were always in my heart, even when I wasn't strong enough to be in your life. They talked quietly as night deepened outside the window. Margaret shared simple stories from her life at the mission, while Daniel found himself opening up about his business successes and failures. When Daniel finally glanced at his watch, he was shocked to see 2 hours had passed. I should go, he said reluctantly. Will you? Margaret hesitated. Will I see you again? Daniel stood, suddenly certain. I'll come back tomorrow. Maybe we could have dinner. Margaret's face brightened. I'd like that very much. At the door, Daniel turned awkwardly, unsure how to say goodbye. Margaret solved the dilemma by stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him in a gentle hug. I've prayed for this moment every day, she whispered against his shoulder. Daniel closed his eyes and returned the embrace, feeling something broken inside him begin to heal. Daniel slipped through the mission's back door the following week, arriving earlier than he'd told Margaret. He found himself oddly nervous. His designer suit and Italian leather shoes felt out of place among the worn linoleum and simple wooden tables. An older man with weathered hands looked up from chopping vegetables. You lost, mister? I'm here to help, Daniel said, removing his suit jacket. Margaret, she's my mother. The man's eyebrows shot up. Margaret's boy? Well, I'll be. He wiped his hands on his apron and extended one. Frank, been volunteering here 8 years. Daniel shook his hand, surprised by the man's firm grip. Any chance I could get an apron? 10 minutes later, Margaret walked into the kitchen and stopped short. There stood her son, sleeves rolled up, stirring a massive pot of stew while chatting with Frank about the local baseball team. Daniel? Her voice wavered. He turned, wooden spoon in hand. Hope you don't mind me starting without you. Frank says I make a decent sous chef. Margaret's face bloomed with joy as she tied on her own apron. Mind? It's wonderful. That evening, Daniel worked alongside his mother, serving meals to people society had forgotten. He noticed how Margaret knew everyone by name, not just the volunteers, but every person in line. She remembered their stories, their ailments, their small victories. Hey, Margaret, got that interview tomorrow, called a man with a patched coat. I'll be praying for you, Joe, she answered warmly. And how's your sister doing? Daniel watched his mother move through the room, her presence bringing comfort to those around her. The mission wasn't just a soup kitchen, it was a community. People laughed despite their hardships. They shared what little they had. They looked out for each other. After the rush died down, a young volunteer approached Daniel shyly. You're really Margaret's son, the businessman? Daniel nodded, scrubbing a stubborn pot. She talks about you all the time. Shows us your picture from the newspaper when you made that big deal last year. The young man looked at him with something like awe. She's always saying how proud she island. Daniel's hands stilled under the soapy water. She's proud of me? Says you've got a heart bigger than anyone knows. The volunteer grinned. Guess she was right. The pattern continued through the next few weeks. Daniel spent his days at the office and his evenings at the mission. He learned to make cornbread that didn't stick to the pan. He helped fix the leaky roof. He listened to stories from people he would have previously crossed the street to avoid. His wife called constantly, demanding explanations for his absences. Daniel deflected her questions, knowing the truth would only spark another fight. One evening, as they closed the mission, Margaret hung her apron on its hook with a contented sigh. Walking me home tonight? She asked. Under a sky scattered with stars, they strolled through quiet streets. Margaret recounted the time a raccoon had gotten into the mission's pantry. Frank chased it with a broom, she said, demonstrating with sweeping motions. Round and round the kitchen island they went like something from a cartoon. Daniel burst out laughing, the sound echoing off nearby buildings. Margaret joined in, her laughter light and musical. For a moment, Daniel felt transported back to childhood, before everything fell apart. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like this freely, without calculation or restraint. It felt like rediscovering a part of himself he'd forgotten existed. Candlelight flickered across polished silver and crystal glasses at the Prestons' annual dinner party. Daniel smiled mechanically as Vanessa, his bride of barely a month, charmed the mayor with practiced ease. The grand dining room buzzed with important people, bank presidents, real estate developers, politicians, all connections vital to Daniel's business future. More wine, Mr. Harrington? A server appeared at his elbow. Daniel shook his head, glancing at his watch. If he left by 9, he could still help Margaret with the mission's evening cleanup. Vanessa caught his eye from across the table and frowned. She excused herself from her conversation and slid into the empty chair beside him. That's the 3rd time you've checked your watch in 10 minutes, she hissed through her perfect smile. The Prestons are our most important connection. I know, Daniel murmured. I just need to be somewhere later. Again? Vanessa's manicured nails dug into his arm. You've been disappearing every night this week. People are starting to talk. The dessert course arrived tiny works of art on bone china plates. Daniel pushed his around without taking a bite. The conversation around him felt hollow after evenings at the mission, where people shared real struggles and genuine laughter. After dinner, guests drifted to the sunroom for brandies and business talk. Vanessa cornered Daniel behind a massive potted fern. Where exactly do you keep going? Her perfume was suffocating, her eyes hard despite her smile. Tell me the truth. Is it another woman? Daniel sighed. No, it's not like that. Then what? Our wedding was a disaster, and now you're barely home. What am I supposed to think? I've been visiting my mother, Daniel said quietly. At the mission downtown. Vanessa's face contorted with disgust. That homeless woman? The one who ruined our wedding? You can't be serious. She's not homeless. She has an apartment above the mission. An apartment, Vanessa snorted. How quaint. And you've been, what, playing charity case with the beggars instead of networking with people who actually matter? A strange feeling swelled in Daniel's chest, something between shame and anger. Those people have names, Vanessa. They're not just beggars. Listen to yourself. She glanced around to ensure no one was listening. Do you have any idea what you're risking? My father already thinks you're unstable after that wedding scene. If word gets out you're spending your evenings in a soup kitchen with that disgrace, don't call her that. The words came out sharper than he intended. What would you prefer? Drunk? Addict? She abandoned you, Daniel, left you with nothing, and now you're throwing away everything we've built for her? Daniel looked down at his polished shoes, his designer suit, his wedding band that felt increasingly like a shackle. She's changed. She's gotten help. I don't care if she's Mother Teresa now, Vanessa snapped. What matters is what people think. Perception is reality in our world. Maybe our world needs to change, Daniel suggested weakly. Vanessa's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. Don't you dare ruin everything we've worked for. My family has invested too much in you and us. If you want to play savior on Sunday mornings, fine. But this nightly disappearing act stops now. She straightened his tie with forceful precision. The Hendersons are waiting to discuss the riverfront deal. Pull yourself together and come be the man I married. Without waiting for his response, she glided back to their guests, her smile never faltering. Snow fell in gentle flurries outside the mission windows as Christmas Eve settled over the town. Inside, the humble space glowed with strings of colored lights, and paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling. Daniel stood behind a serving table, ladling steaming turkey stew into bowls, while Margaret placed freshly baked rolls beside each portion. More cranberry sauce, Mr. Harrington? Asked a cheerful volunteer. Absolutely, Daniel replied, smiling more freely than he had in months. He'd made his choice. Despite Vanessa's fury when he'd announced he was spending Christmas Eve at the mission instead of her parents' exclusive party, he knew he was exactly where he belonged. The text messages on his phone had grown increasingly hostile throughout the evening, but he'd silenced it hours ago. Margaret moved beside him, her face peaceful as she greeted each person by name. Merry Christmas, Thomas. How's that cough doing? Better? Good. Betty, those mittens look wonderful on you. Daniel watched in awe. These weren't just nameless faces to her. They were friends, people with stories and dignity. From the corner, a volunteer played carols on an old upright piano. Several guests joined in singing, their voices creating a harmony more beautiful than any professional choir Daniel had ever heard at society parties. Daniel, would you help Jim with his tray? His arthritis is acting up tonight, Margaret asked. Daniel hurried to assist an elderly man with weathered hands, carrying his dinner to a table decorated with pine branches and candles. Mighty kind of you, Jim said. Your mama's been talking about you for weeks. Never seen her so happy. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. She's changed my life. As the evening wound down, Margaret pulled Daniel aside. I have something for you, she said, reaching into a paper bag beneath the serving table. She handed him a small package wrapped in newspaper and tied with twine. It's not fancy, but it's perfect, Daniel said before even opening it. And he meant it. His fingers trembled slightly as he unwrapped the gift. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. The stitches weren't perfectly even, but that only made it more precious. I worked on it during breaks, Margaret explained. My hands aren't as steady as they once were. Daniel ran his fingers over the soft yarn, remembering how, as a child, he'd watch her knitting by lamplight after long days of work. Before everything fell apart, before the addiction took her away, Mom. His voice cracked. The words still felt new on his tongue after so many years of absence. You don't have to. It's beautiful. He wrapped it around his neck immediately. The best gift I've ever received. The mission director announced closing time, thanking everyone for coming, and wishing them a blessed Christmas. As people bundled up to face the cold night, Daniel and Margaret worked side by side, washing dishes and storing leftovers. When they finally stepped outside, fresh snow was falling in thick, silent flakes. The world had transformed into a pristine wonderland while they'd been inside. Look at that, Margaret whispered, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Isn't it something? Daniel tucked her arm through his. Let me walk you home. They moved slowly through the quieted streets, their footprints marking the untouched snow. The scarf warmed Daniel's neck, But something even warmer filled his chest, a feeling of rightness he'd been searching for his entire life. January brought bitter cold to town. 3 weeks after Christmas, Daniel arrived at the mission earlier than usual, carrying a box of donated blankets from his company. The evening meal service was just finishing, and he spotted Margaret wiping down tables while humming softly to herself. Need an extra pair of hands? Daniel set down the box and grabbed a dishcloth. Margaret's face brightened. You're a sight for sore eyes. How was your meeting? Productive. I closed the Henderson account. Daniel didn't mention how his business partners had questioned his recent priorities. His frequent absences from social events and increasing time at the mission had become topics of whispered conversation. They worked side by side in comfortable silence. Several volunteers nodded respectfully to Daniel, no longer surprised by the presence of the town's prominent businessman among them. In just a few weeks, he'd become a regular fixture, rolling up his designer sleeves to wash dishes and serve food. Did you eat? Margaret asked, stacking the last of the clean plates. I grabbed something earlier. Daniel glanced at her, noticing the fatigue in her eyes. You look tired. Why don't we finish up early tonight? Margaret shook her head. Just need to mop the kitchen floor first. As she turned toward the supply closet, Margaret suddenly stopped. Her hand flew to her chest. The color drained from her face. Mom? Daniel moved toward her. I'm fine, just a little. Margaret's words cut off as she swayed. The cleaning cloth dropped from her fingers. Daniel rushed forward as her knees buckled. He caught her just before she hit the floor. Someone call an ambulance! His voice echoed through the mission hall. Margaret's breathing came in short, painful gasps. Her eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on Daniel's face. Stay with me, Mom. Daniel cradled her head. Help is coming. The next moments blurred into chaos. Volunteers crowded around. Someone pressed a damp cloth to Margaret's forehead. The wail of sirens grew closer. BP's dropping, a paramedic announced as they loaded Margaret onto a stretcher. Possible cardiac event. Daniel climbed into the ambulance, clutching Margaret's frail hand. Her fingers were cold against his palm. I'm right here, he whispered, though her eyes remained closed. At the hospital, doctors whisked her away, leaving Daniel alone in a sterile waiting room. He paced the floor, checking his watch every few minutes. The plastic chairs filled with mission volunteers who'd followed them to the hospital. After what felt like hours, a doctor in a white coat approached. Mr. Harrington? Daniel steeled himself. How is she? The doctor gestured toward a quiet corner. Your mother has advanced coronary artery disease. The tests show significant blockage in multiple vessels. I'm afraid it's quite serious. But you can fix it, right? Surgery, or... Daniel's voice faltered. Her heart has sustained considerable damage. Her age and overall health complicate matters. The doctor's expression softened. We're stabilizing her now, but she'll need specialized care. Daniel sank into a chair, the weight of the diagnosis crushing down on him. Can I see her? Minutes later, he entered a dimly lit room. Margaret lay small and pale against white sheets, tubes and monitors surrounding her like silent sentinels. Her eyes opened as he approached. Daniel, her voice was barely audible. He took her hand between both of his. The shock of her collapse, the diagnosis, everything crashed over him in a wave. For years, he'd lived in a world of business deals and social climbing while she'd struggled alone. Now she might be slipping away just when he'd found her again. I'm here, Mom, he whispered, stunned by how quickly everything had changed. I'm right here. Daniel found the hospital chapel by accident. Wandering the halls after midnight, unable to sit still in the waiting room, he'd pushed through a heavy wooden door and discovered the small sanctuary. A few electric candles flickered on the altar, casting long shadows across empty pews. He sank into the back row, his body heavy with exhaustion. The doctor's words echoed in his mind. Advanced coronary artery disease. Multiple blockages. Poor prognosis without immediate intervention. Expensive treatments. The silence pressed in around him. Daniel buried his face in his hands, shoulders slumping as the weight of the day crashed over him. In the stillness, an unwelcome memory surfaced his wedding day, months ago now. The morning had dawned perfect. 5,000 white roses adorning the grand stone church. Champagne flowing, his future secured by marriage into the wealthiest family in town. Then he saw her again. Margaret standing timidly at the gate, clutching that worn satchel, her weathered face looking up at him with such hope. And what had he done? Look at this, he'd said loudly, making sure his groomsmen could hear. A beggar at my wedding. You've wandered into the wrong world, lady. The laughter that followed, the smirk on his own face, the way her eyes had dimmed with hurt. Oh God. Daniel whispered into the empty chapel. What kind of man mocks his own mother? Tears welled up, hot and sudden. He hadn't cried since he was a child. Now they came in waves, racking his body as he bent forward in the pew. All these years, while he'd been building his image, his status, his wealth, she'd been fighting to survive, working at the mission, helping others despite having nothing herself, living in that tiny apartment with its second-hand furniture and carefully preserved photos. And even after his cruelty, she'd come to give her blessing. Not to disrupt, not to demand anything, just to see her son married. A sob escaped him. The golden cufflinks on his shirt caught the candlelight. They'd cost more than Margaret probably spent on food in a month. I'm sorry, he whispered to the empty room. I'm so sorry. The chapel door creaked open. Daniel quickly wiped his eyes, straightening in the pew. Victoria stood in the doorway, her designer coat pulled tight around her slender frame. Her face was tight with irritation. I've been looking everywhere for you, she said, her heels clicking sharply as she approached. The desk finally told me you might be here. My mother might be dying, Daniel said simply. Victoria sighed, settling beside him with careful distance. Daniel, be reasonable. You barely know this woman. She abandoned you, remember? And now you're throwing away everything we've built. She's my mother. She's a homeless addict who showed up to ruin our wedding. Victoria's voice hardened. The Prestons are reconsidering their investment in your company. Did you know that? Your little charity project is costing us everything. Daniel stared at her, seeing for the first time the coldness behind her perfect features. It's time to let her go, Victoria continued. The hospital social workers can handle this. We have the charity gala next weekend, and the board meeting on Tuesday. She placed a manicured hand on his arm. This has gone far enough. It's time to choose, Daniel, her or me. That woman or the life we've built. The hospital room hummed with the steady rhythm of machines. Daniel sat in the vinyl chair pulled close to Margaret's bed, his suit jacket draped over the back, tie loosened. The night nurse had brought him a thin blanket hours ago, but sleep remained impossible. Margaret lay still against the stark white sheets, her face pale in the dim light. An IV dripped steadily beside her. Even in sleep, lines of pain creased her forehead. Daniel checked his phone 3:17 a.m. Victoria had sent 6 text messages, each more demanding than the last. The final one read, I expect your answer by morning. He set the phone face down on the side table and gently took Margaret's hand. Her skin felt paper-thin beneath his fingers, the veins prominent and blue. Daniel? Margaret's voice came softly, her eyes fluttering open. I'm here, Mom. The words still felt strange on his tongue, but right somehow. She smiled weakly. You should go home, get some rest. I'm not going anywhere. Margaret shifted slightly, wincing with the effort. The nurse told me about the treatments they're recommending. The cost. Don't worry about that, but I do worry. Her eyes, though tired, held a clarity that pierced him. I've been thinking about what your wife said. She's right about some things. Daniel stiffened. Victoria doesn't understand. She understands that I've disrupted your life. Margaret squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. Daniel, I didn't come back to burden you or to ruin what you've built. If it would be easier— Stop, Daniel interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. Just stop. I only want what's best for you, she whispered. What's best for me? He let out a bitter laugh. Do you know what I've become? That man who mocked you at the church gate? That's who I've been for years, measuring everything by its price tag or status, even my marriage. Margaret watched him silently, her eyes never leaving his face. I had everything I thought I wanted. Daniel's voice cracked. The right address, the right connections, the right wife, and I've never felt emptier. Dawn began to creep through the blinds, painting thin stripes of light across the blanket. Outside the door, the hospital was waking up, carts rolling past, muted conversations, the distant ring of telephones. You don't need to throw everything away for me, Margaret said softly. I've made my peace with my life. These months with you have been more than I ever hoped for. Something broke inside Daniel then. Years of carefully constructed walls crumbled in an instant. Tears spilled down his cheeks, unchecked and unashamed. I don't care about the money, he whispered, bending forward until his forehead rested against their joined hands. I don't care about Victoria or the Prestons or any of it. His shoulders shook as the tears came faster. All those years wasted chasing things that don't matter. A sob caught in his throat. I just want to be your son again, if you'll still have me. Margaret reached out with her free hand, stroking his hair just as she had when he was a little boy. You never stop being my son, she murmured, her own tears falling. Not for a single day. In that sterile hospital room, as morning light slowly filled the space, Daniel held his mother's hand and felt, for the first time in years, that he was exactly where he belonged. Daniel waited in the expansive living room of the penthouse apartment he shared with Victoria. Morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the untouched breakfast spread on the glass dining table. He'd arranged everything perfectly: her favorite pastries, fresh squeezed orange juice, flowers in the crystal vase she'd selected from their registry. The elevator dinged. Victoria stepped out, shopping bags dangling from her wrists, her hair freshly styled. She froze when she saw him. "I thought you'd still be at the hospital with her." Daniel stood. "We need to talk." Victoria set her bags down and removed her sunglasses. "I assume you've made your decision then." "I have." He gestured to the couch, but she remained standing. "I'm not abandoning my mother," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. "She needs specialized care, and I'm going to make sure she gets it." Victoria's perfectly lined lips pressed into a thin slash. "And what about what I need? What about our future? Everything we planned?" "Plans change. People change." Daniel stepped closer. "These past weeks with her have shown me what really matters. I don't expect you to understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Victoria's voice rose sharply. "You're choosing a woman who threw you away like garbage over the life we built together. That's not fair. She was sick, fighting addiction, and now she's sick again. How convenient." Victoria laughed bitterly. "Open your eyes, Daniel. She's using you." The calm Daniel had practiced all morning began to slip. "You don't know her. I know her type." Victoria picked up a crystal figurine from the side table, turning it in her hands. "The real question is, do you know me? Do you think I'll stand by while you throw away everything for some charity case? She's my mother, and I'm your wife." The figurine crashed against the wall, shattering into glittering shards. "We took vows." Daniel didn't flinch. "Vows I couldn't fully honor because I've been living a lie. This isn't about choosing her over you. It's about finally being honest about who I am and what I value." Victoria's face flushed with anger. "The Prestons will pull every investment from your company. You'll be ruined." "Maybe," Daniel nodded. "But I'll still have my conscience." Victoria grabbed her purse, hands shaking. "You'll regret this. When she dies, and she will die, Daniel, you'll have nothing and no one. I'll have myself back." Daniel stood his ground as she stormed toward the elevator. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I truly am." She jabbed the button, then turned. "Your little redemption story is very touching, but real life isn't so forgiving. You've made an enemy today." The elevator doors closed on her tear-streaked, furious face. 3 days later, Daniel sat in his attorney's office, signing the final documents. "That's 40% of your shares in Harrington Developments," the lawyer said, sliding the papers into a folder. "The funds will be transferred this afternoon." "And that covers the full treatment plan?" Daniel asked, "with some left over for ongoing care." His attorney leaned back. "Daniel, are you certain about this? The company vote is next week. Without these shares, you'll lose controlling interest." Daniel closed the pen with a decisive click. Some things are worth more than control. Outside, spring sunshine warmed his face. For the first time in years, his steps felt light as he walked toward the hospital. A weight lifted despite all he had surrendered. Daniel stood back and surveyed the guest bedroom, now transformed for Margaret. Sunlight poured through freshly washed windows, catching the soft yellow of the new curtains he'd selected. A vase of wildflowers brightened the nightstand, their simple beauty more fitting than the elaborate arrangements that had filled his wedding. "Just one more touch," he murmured, carefully placing a framed photograph on the dresser, a faded image of Margaret holding him as a toddler, both of them laughing at something long forgotten. The doorbell rang. Daniel hurried downstairs, opening the door to find the hospital transport service with Margaret in a wheelchair. "Here we are, Mrs. Harrington. Home sweet home," the attendant said cheerfully. Margaret looked up at the sleek modern house with wide eyes. "It's so grand. It's just a house." Daniel knelt beside her wheelchair. "But now it's your home too." Inside, Margaret's gaze traveled over the high ceilings and designer furniture. "I don't want to be a burden, Daniel." "You're not a burden." He squeezed her hand. "You're my mother." He wheeled her to her new room, watching her face as she took in the thoughtful details: the quilted bedspread, the stack of library books he'd selected based on titles he'd spotted in her apartment, the cushioned chair positioned perfectly by the window. "Oh, Daniel." Her fingers trembled as they touched the photograph. "You kept this?" "It was in the box of things Dad left me." He adjusted her pillow. I used to look at it every night before I got too busy for memories. That evening, Daniel woke before dawn to prepare breakfast. He wasn't much of a cook, but he remembered his mother's simple oatmeal with brown sugar and cinnamon from his childhood. The kitchen, usually pristine and barely used, filled with warm, homey smells. When Margaret appeared in her robe, leaning on her walker, Daniel pulled out a chair for her at the small breakfast nook rather than the formal dining room. "I hope it tastes like you remember," he said, setting the bowl before her. Margaret took a spoonful and closed her eyes. "Just like I used to make." Her smile deepened the wrinkles around her eyes, though I recall someone always wanting extra brown sugar. Some things never change. Daniel sprinkled more sugar on his bowl, feeling 8 years old again. They fell into a gentle routine over the following days. Mornings with shared breakfasts, afternoons with Margaret resting while Daniel worked from home, evenings watching old movies or simply talking, filling in the missing years piece by piece. Word spread quickly through town. Daniel noticed the whispers when he took Margaret to her doctor appointments or when they visited the small park nearby. At the grocery store, he caught snippets of conversation in the next aisle. "Can you believe it? Threw away his marriage to that Preston girl for a homeless woman. I heard he's losing his company over it." Daniel pretended not to hear, focusing instead on selecting the ripest peaches, Margaret's favorite. The whispers weren't all unkind. Outside the pharmacy, Mrs. Wilson, his former Sunday school teacher, stopped him. "I always knew there was goodness in you, Daniel Harrington." She patted his arm. "Your mother raised you right, even if it was just for those early years." Even at the office, opinions divided. His assistant handed him a stack of messages, hesitating before adding, "My grandmother lived with us after her stroke. Hardest thing we ever did. But not one of us regrets it. Not for a minute." That evening, as Daniel helped Margaret into bed, she said quietly, "People are talking, aren't they? About you taking me in?" "Let them talk." Daniel tucked the blanket around her. "I spent too many years caring what others thought. Now I only care what I think, and I think I'm finally doing something right." The mission's dining hall bustled with activity unlike anything it had seen in years. Volunteers in aprons moved efficiently between tables, serving hot meals to twice the usual number of guests. In the corner, a fresh coat of paint brightened walls that had been dingy for decades. Daniel paused in the doorway, amazed at the transformation. Just last month, this place had been running on fumes, with the same 3 elderly volunteers struggling to keep up. Now, a dozen new faces worked alongside them. "Quite a change, isn't it?" Pastor Mike approached, carrying a box of donated blankets. "Your mother's story touched a lot of hearts." "I don't understand," Daniel said. "I didn't ask anyone for help." "Sometimes people just need to see someone else do the right thing first." Pastor Mike nodded toward a woman organizing canned goods. "That's Ellen Peterson. Her husband's the bank president. She said watching you choose family over fortune made her rethink her priorities." Across the room, Daniel spotted his former golf buddy, Richard, serving soup. The same Richard who'd mocked homeless people at their country club dinners. Now he chatted warmly with an elderly man whose clothes had seen better days. A delivery truck rumbled outside. The driver unloaded boxes of fresh produce, meat, and dairy products enough to feed everyone for a week. "From Harrison's Grocery," the driver explained. "Mr. Harrison said to tell you it's going to be a monthly donation from now on." That evening, Daniel pushed Margaret's wheelchair through the mission, showing her the improvements. Her eyes widened at the newly stocked pantry, the repaired roof, the working heaters. "All these years," she whispered, "I prayed for God to bless this place. I never imagined he'd use my son to do it." Daniel knelt beside her. "It wasn't me. I just stopped getting in the way." The following Sunday morning, Margaret insisted on attending church. Daniel worried about her strength but recognized the determination in her eyes. "I've missed 20 years of Sundays," she said as he helped her into a simple blue dress. "I don't want to miss another." The church steps presented a challenge, but 2 ushers rushed forward with a portable ramp they'd built just for her. Inside, familiar faces from the mission mixed with congregation members who had previously kept their distance from those people. When Margaret's wheelchair appeared in the center aisle, the organist faltered. A hush fell over the sanctuary. Then, slowly, people began to stand. First the front row, then the entire congregation rose to their feet, faces warm with respect. "Welcome home, Margaret," Pastor Mike called from the pulpit. A woman stepped forward with flowers. Daniel recognized her as a former client who had canceled their business when news of his mother spread. Now she leaned down to embrace Margaret. "Your son taught us all something about courage," she said. Margaret's hands trembled as she accepted the bouquet. Tears sparkled in her eyes, but her smile radiated a joy that transcended her frail body. She looked up at Daniel, who stood tall beside her wheelchair. "My son," she said, voice carrying in the quiet church, "God wastes nothing, not even our hardest years apart." Daniel blinked back his own tears, overwhelmed by the simple truth. The congregation remained standing, their applause filling the vaulted ceiling with a sound like rain, after drought renewal washing away years of indifference, awakening something long dormant in the heart of their community. Spring melted into summer, then autumn painted the town in warm hues. Margaret's health stabilized enough for short walks in the garden, her strength returning in small but precious increments. The doctor spoke cautiously of managing her condition rather than imminent crisis, a victory that Daniel celebrated quietly each night in thankful prayer. His days fell into a gentle rhythm, mornings at his scaled-down business, where he'd kept enough clients to live comfortably without the exhausting pursuit of status. Afternoons often found him beside Margaret, reading to her or simply sharing comfortable silence on the porch swing he'd installed for her enjoyment. Evenings were devoted to the mission, where he'd taken on administrative duties that lightened the burden on older volunteers. "You need to stop hovering," Margaret told him one October afternoon, shooing him away from her chair where he'd been adjusting her blanket for the third time. "I'm not going anywhere just yet." "Can't a son take care of his mother?" Daniel smiled, though his eyes betrayed lingering worry. "There's taking care and there's smothering." Her eyes twinkled with the spark that illness couldn't dim. "Go help Pastor Mike with the fundraiser plans. I'll be fine with my book." The mission's annual Thanksgiving fundraiser had grown ambitious this year. What was once a modest potluck had expanded to include the entire community. Daniel found himself in charge of coordinating food donations, a task that consumed his evenings but filled him with quiet satisfaction. "We're expecting double last year's attendance," Pastor Mike announced at the planning meeting. "We'll need more volunteers to serve food." "My friend Sarah might help," offered Ellen Peterson. "She teaches 4th grade and has such a way with people." The evening of the fundraiser arrived with a crisp chill in the air. Daniel arrived early, helping to transform the community center with autumn decorations. Margaret insisted on attending, bundled warmly against the November cold. "Daniel, come meet Sarah," Ellen called, waving him over to where she stood with a woman in a burgundy sweater. Sarah Bennett had warm brown eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and an easy manner that put people instantly at ease. When Daniel shook her hand, she didn't release it immediately. "I've heard so much about you," she said. "Your mother showed me pictures of the garden you planted for her. Those sunflowers were magnificent." "You know my mother? Sarah brings books to homebound mission folks," Margaret explained, appearing beside them. "She's been visiting me Tuesday afternoons for months." Daniel raised his eyebrows. "You never mentioned that. A mother's entitled to some secrets." Margaret winked at Sarah. As the evening progressed, Daniel found himself gravitating toward Sarah again and again. They worked side by side, serving turkey and stuffing, falling into conversation that flowed without effort. She told him about her classroom, her passion for literacy, and her volunteer work. He shared stories of the mission's transformation. "I've never met anyone who talks about helping others the way you do," Sarah said, as they cleared plates later. "Most people treat charity as obligation. You talk about it like it's privilege." "That's exactly what it is," Daniel replied. "I spent years chasing things that didn't matter. Now I wake up grateful every day." Sarah's smile reached her eyes. "I'd like to hear more about that journey sometime." "I'd like that too," Daniel said, feeling something quiet and hopeful unfold in his chest. Winter passed in a gentle blur of coffee meetings and long walks through snowy streets. Daniel and Sarah moved carefully at first, both recognizing something precious unfolding between them that deserved patience. They met for lunch between her school days and his business meetings. They volunteered together at the mission's food pantry on weekends. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence in the community center, sorting donations side by side. Margaret watched it all with quiet joy, pretending not to notice when Sarah lingered after her Tuesday reading sessions, or when Daniel suddenly found reasons to be home during those visits. "She brings light into a room," Margaret told Daniel one evening after Sarah had gone. "And you smile differently when she's around." Daniel looked up from the dishes he was washing. "Is that your subtle way of giving approval? As if you needed it." Margaret patted his arm. "But yes, I approve with all my heart." By springtime, their connection had deepened. Sarah joined them for Sunday dinners, fitting so naturally into their small family that it seemed she had always belonged there. She brought homemade bread and stories from her classroom that made Margaret laugh until tears came to her eyes. She helped Daniel plant new flowers in the garden beds he'd built for his mother. "I want to show you something," Daniel said one evening, as they walked back from the mission. He led Sarah to the old maple tree in the park, where they'd had their first real conversation months ago. You carved our initials? Sarah gasped, spotting the small heart etched into the bark. Daniel shook his head, embarrassed. Too cheesy? Perfectly cheesy. She rose on tiptoes to kiss his cheek. I love it. As summer bloomed, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that Sarah was the person he wanted beside him for all his remaining days. She understood his past without judgment and celebrated his present with genuine joy. Most importantly, she loved Margaret with the same tender care he did. The mission garden had been Margaret's project all spring, a place where residents could grow vegetables and flowers. Despite her health limitations, she directed volunteers with gentle authority, creating a sanctuary of blooming roses and tall sunflowers. On warm evenings, she often sat there in her wheelchair, face turned toward the setting Sunday. One such evening in late June, Daniel led Sarah into the garden where Margaret waited. Fairy lights twinkled in the arbor above, installed earlier that day with help from mission volunteers who'd kept his secret with knowing smiles. What's all this? Sarah asked, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. Daniel took both her hands in his. Sarah Bennett, you walked into my life when I was learning how to be whole again. You never asked me to be anyone but myself. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes as Daniel knelt before her. I don't want another day without you in it. He produced a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band with a single diamond. Will you marry me? Yes, she whispered without hesitation. With all my heart, yes. As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, he glanced at his mother. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, hands clasped together, her face radiant with joy. The setting sun caught the tears on her cheeks, turning them to gold. You've made an old woman very happy, Margaret said softly. Both of you have. On an autumn Saturday, sunshine spilled through stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned light across the wooden pews of the same church where Daniel had once stood in arrogance. Today, those same pews held only people who truly mattered: mission volunteers, teachers from Sarah's school, and neighbors who had become friends. No extravagant decorations adorned the space. Just simple bouquets of wildflowers gathered that morning from Margaret's garden. No designer gown or diamond tiara for the bride. Sarah wore a modest cream dress with lace at the collar, her hair adorned with a single white rose. Margaret sat in the front row, her slight frame wrapped in a new blue dress Daniel had insisted on buying for the occasion. Though her body remained frail, her eyes shone with unmistakable strength as she watched her son straighten his tie at the altar. The wedding party consisted only of 2 mission volunteers as attendants. No groomsmen competed for status or jockeyed for position. The organ played softly, not the grand processional march of before, but a gentle melody that filled the church like a prayer. When Sarah appeared at the back of the church, Daniel's breath caught. She walked alone, carrying a bouquet of Margaret's roses. Her smile, open and honest, belonged only to him. You look beautiful, Daniel whispered when she reached him. So do you, she answered, touching his face with her fingertips. The pastor, the same man who had witnessed Daniel's moment of shame months ago, now beamed at the couple before him. Today we gather to celebrate not just the union of 2 hearts, but the blessing of a family made whole through love and forgiveness. As they exchanged vows, Daniel's voice carried clearly through the church. No stumbling this time, no distraction, just promises spoken with absolute certainty. Sarah's responses came just as steadily, her eyes never leaving his. When they exchanged rings, simple gold bands without ostentation, Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The elderly church elder who had recognized her on that fateful day reached across the aisle to pat her shoulder. By the power vested in me, the pastor concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Their kiss was brief but tender. Applause filled the small church, not the polite, restrained applause of society, but the genuine celebration of people who understood the journey that had led to this moment. After the ceremony, as guests gathered in the church garden for a simple reception, Daniel crossed to where Margaret sat watching the celebration. The golden afternoon light caught the silver in her hair, turning it luminous. He knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her weathered hand between both of his. I never thanked you properly, he said softly. For what, dear? Margaret asked, her voice gentle. For coming back. For being brave enough to find me, even when I wasn't worth finding. Margaret touched his cheek. You were always worth finding. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. When I look at the man I was and the man I've become because of you, because of your own heart, Daniel, I just helped you remember it was there. He pressed her hand to his lips, then looked up at the mother he had once rejected. I am proud to be your son, he whispered. Margaret's smile broke through her tears, radiating a joy that transcended her fragile body. In that moment, surrounded by genuine love instead of shallow admiration, Daniel understood at last what true wealth meant, not counted in dollars or status, but in the courage to choose compassion, in the strength to seek redemption, and in the grace to begin again. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Harrington, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.